Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece. For this interview episode, Pericles and Aspasia, with Yvonne Korshak. We're taking a short break from our narrative this week to talk with Professor Yvonne Korshak, art historian and writer. We'll be focusing on her recently published work of historical fiction, Pericles and Aspasia. Yvonne Korshak received her BA with honours from Harvard and her MA in Classics and Classical Archaeology and PhD in Art History from the University of California, Berkeley. As a professor at Adelphi University, she has taught art history and topics in the humanities, served as chair of the Department of Art and Art History, director of the Honours Program in Liberal Studies, and director of a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute. She has written and spoken widely on topics of Greek art and archaeology and on European painting, particularly on Van Gogh, Courbet and David. Her blog, Let's Talk Off-Broadway, focuses on art and theatre. She has excavated at Old Corinth, Greece, and has visited almost the cities, towns, landscapes and seascapes in Greece, and what today is Turkey, that figure in Pericles and Aspasia. Now, I want to admit straight away that I'm not normally one to seek out works of historical fiction, this mainly due to the amount of historical works I need to be engaged with for my research. While, in the past, I have been dissatisfied with how historical elements have been bent to make a certain story work. However, I can attest that the novel Pericles and Aspasia does not have this shortcoming, and by shortcoming I realise this is purely my subjective opinion. Two things would see that I would once again sample a work of historical fiction. Firstly, I was setting out on a family holiday and therefore taking a short break from the podcast, allowing time to try something different. Secondly, the setting of Pericles and Aspasia piqued my interest, as in the series we had just travelled through a whole myriad of episodes that dealt with this period of time. I was very interested to see how the narrative would be woven into the historical backdrop. After reading Pericles and Aspasia, I was very pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed it. The historical backdrop wasn't there as a backdrop, it was part of the narrative. Not just a convenient setting for a narrative to unfold around. I was blown away by the level of historical detail that was followed to weave the story together. There was no bending or deviating from known history. What Yvonne did was present to us these unfolding historical events, along with the personal and intimate interactions that we cannot get from a work of history. She took all the clues from the works of history to create a narrative that she felt was real and would have been part of the human experience. Let me read to you the words Yvonne writes in describing her work Pericles and Aspasia. The novel unfolds against the backdrop of the arts and history of the Golden Age, seen through the eyes of two individuals who lent their particular brilliance to make it golden. Pericles, the great orator and visionary of democracy, and its most influential woman, Aspasia. Their story takes them from the Agora, Athens marketplace, to the Acropolis, from the raunchy Athenian Port Piraeus mercantile, across the Aegean Sea to East Greece. Pericles and Aspasia, together and apart, navigate treacherous paths from venal calculations to impassioned philosophical inquiry, from high-stakes sea battles to the passions of family life. Pericles and Aspasia engage issues that are vital today, the paradoxes of democracy, the tensions of hierarchy, the ironies of gender, and others. But this novel is immersed in classical Athens, the city, its sunshine, the physical presence, its people, and their struggle and aspirations. Professor Korshak has also been kind enough to put up 3 copies of Pericles and Aspasia in a giveaway in conjunction with the release of this episode. To enter the draw, all you need to do is be following Casting Through Ancient Greece on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, like the post of the interview on your chosen platform, and then share, retweet, or share to your story. Everyone who has done this will go into the draw to win a copy of Pericles and Aspasia. I will let the offer run until Friday the 8th of September, where I will then draw randomly 3 lucky winners and will notify them on the platform they participated on. So, without further ado, let's get to the interview with Professor Yvonne Korshak, where we discuss a whole range of things ranging from her experience writing the book, the relationships between history and fiction, and many historical elements and themes. Welcome to the show, Yvonne. Very grateful you could give us some of your time to come and talk about Pericles and Aspasia.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. I thought before we dive into, I guess, the history and the themes that you do in your book, could we just start with a little about yourself? And could you tell us a bit about your background And what drove you towards studying the ancient world?
It all started in high school in ninth grade. We had an elective, and I chose ancient history. And in my ancient history course, we had to write a report. And to write the report, probably my teacher suggested it. I relied heavily. In those days, it wasn't a matter of, comparing sources. You grabbed a book and used it. Um, and it's a book I'll mention. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. It's Edith Hamilton's A Greek Way to Western Civilization. She was a very eloquent writer, and she wrote about Euripides as the first modern mind. I was interested in theater, and for some reason, the way she wrote about Euripides absolutely captivated me. I wrote my paper, something to do with that area. And I fell in love with Greece, really, through Euripides. A little later, I discovered Pericles' great funeral oration. I was overwhelmed by its brilliance, by its idealism. Of course, we have it in translation, and we have it that Thucydides, as you mentioned in your podcast on Pericles' funeral oration, that Thucydides doesn't pretend to be quoting Pericles exactly. But nevertheless, I was imprinted, and I've lived my life with that funeral oration as a kind of a bright flame. So it was a little after that I had the idea of writing a novel about Pericles and Aspasia. And I graduated from college and thought I knew a lot and had taken some courses. I was an English major, but I had taken pertinent courses and the languages. And I sat down to write the book. I literally did. I thought I was going to write a novel. And I immediately found out I didn't know enough to write the book. So I went to graduate school, really, to learn enough to write the book. And then life intervened. I earned my graduate degrees, but there were demands on me. I became a single mother by a great tragedy, and I had to earn a living. So I taught. I had a full academic career, but I was always learning and reading and learning and reading. And at one point, I said to myself, Yvonne, if you don't know enough now to write this book, you never will. So that's when I sat down the second time and began to write Pericles and Aspasia. So that's kind of the background of the story. It's an absolute infatuation. I shouldn't perhaps dismiss it with the word infatuation. It's a true love. I love this period. I love these characters. That's why I enjoy your podcast so much, because you're giving it to me just as I wrote it for myself.
Yeah, it's definitely helps when your work revolves around something that you're truly interested in and something that you really love as well.
Absolutely, that's the key.
Yeah, I find that same thing with the podcast. Not that it's my primary source of income or anything, but it started off as a great hobby and it's just been growing. So it's been very enjoyable.
That's clear.
Now, obviously, you mentioned obviously you wanted to do Pericles and Aspasia early on, but then you went to graduate school to start gathering, I guess, some more knowledge to be able to tackle that project.
Right.
So obviously, you gained some academic qualifications, and you have produced I guess, works of history. Could you tell us a bit about those before we sort of get started into the novel?
Well, I wrote on art history. My final degree is actually art history with a specialty in classical Greek art. And so I wrote on classical Greek art. I also wrote, because I taught at a university where it wasn't the kind of university that has a professor of this area of art history and another professor of that area of art history. At my university, I was the professor of art history, which meant that I talked with my students. We had courses in the whole area, all the areas of art history. So I actually wrote on some almost modern European artists. I've written on Van Gogh. I've written my particular interest with Van Gogh and also Courbet and the French painter David. I'm interested in hidden imagery. There are different kinds of hidden imagery, but I'm interested in deciphering the real puzzles, if you will, the clues, the tantalizing indications that painters imbue their paintings with just below the surface, you might say, and uncovering them so we can all enjoy them. But in the field of Greek art, I wrote in particular a book called About Frontal Faces in Athenian vase painting. Why frontal faces? What's the deal? Well, what I noticed as a young student was that in Greek art, speaking up from the archaic and classical periods that we both, Mark, in our work have been dealing with, not the later Hellenistic period, although you may get there.
Yeah.
I won't.
One day.
I'm stuck on classical. But I observed, as you will observe, that the painters always painted the faces in profile, as they do in Egypt. Every once in a while, you see a frontal face, a face viewed from the front. It's an anomaly, and that perked my curiosity. What was the answer? Why? Was it just happenstance? Was there a reason that now and then the vase painter, instead of showing the face in profile, as was the absolute convention, turned the face directly at you? So to answer that question, I assembled photographs, so to say, or images that I could use of every single frontal face I could find, and looked for a pattern. And I discovered a pattern. The frontal face is used for basically two types of characters. Characters that are dead or characters that are drunk. And what I realized was the common denominator between those two types of characters was a loss of self-control. So, in other words, this is really a message. The profile is the way it should be, the way a human, quote, should be shown in this convention, quote unquote. You deviate from the convention as a kind of analog of showing things not as they should be when people are drunk or when they're dead. That's not the right way. That's not the golden mean. That's not the way the Greeks think it should be. And of course, drunks include satyrs and maenads and human beings represented at symposia every once in a while. So when you're gazing, you and your viewers gazing at Greek face painting, every once in a while you'll see that frontal face, and perhaps you'll think about the fact that's the artist's way of conveying a lack of control. The human being has lost control of his own being, and that's an ideogram, if you will, for that idea. So that was Frontal Faces. The full title is Frontal Faces in Attic, as in Athenian, Frontal Faces in Attic vase painting. And that was a great adventure for me. That was a really unique moment. Oh, I get it when I finally realized it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't actually realize that. So, yeah, the change in convention is actually to represent something different
That's right.
than the norm. Yeah, it's very
That's
interesting.
right.
Um, well, I guess let's get back to Pericles and Aspasia. You
Yes, let's. I love to.
you indicated that obviously you had your false start, and then you went to university or in college to get more knowledge, and then you hinted that you then sat down to write again. What triggered that second attempt? Like, was there something in particular, and how long ago did you actually start writing?
35 years ago, and age. I came to a point where I thought, you just have to settle down and write this book, or you won't write it.
Hmm.
So I actually worked on the manuscript on and off for about 35 years.
And so, was there a accumulation of knowledge along the way where you would write a bit and then want to go back to gather more information about historically what was happening?
Um, Basically, by the time I sat down to write the book, I had learned what I needed to know. What I, to say needed to know sounds skimpy. What I yearned to know, what I wanted to know. I wanted to know everything the way you know everything about your own culture. Not that we all know everything literally about our own culture. I don't know about you. You don't know about me. We're different countries. But in the sense that we do know our own worlds, I wanted to know that world. And I had learned so much about the history, but also the archaeology, the details of everyday life, because us novels are about everyday life, really, that I felt I had learned what I needed. However, that's has to be footnoted. I ran into issues of history that I didn't know or that were controversial, where I had to stop and read the various interpretations, for instance, of a particular event in history and figure out what is the most plausible. Because I was determined to find the most plausible explanation. If there was not a sure explanation, at least let it be the most plausible. Because you see, I had to believe this book. And if there was something in the book that wasn't true, it would spoil it for me. It would break the film of belief. And I knew that was true for my readers too. My readers need to know that if they read something in the book, it's real
Mm.
to the degree that it can be. So yes, sometimes I had to go back to history in particular and read all that I could about a particular issue or moment or event. But basically, I had stopped my mind with
Mm.
what it took to imagine the novel real.
Yeah, and I think, well, before we started recording, we were discussing how it was very interesting how you came across my podcast as you were writing the events in Pericles and Aspasia, which lined up with where I currently was during the show. And then when I received your book, obviously I'd finished writing all the historical elements of those episodes, and it was interesting to see this narrative behind closed doors of all the things I'd already covered historically. And I found that quite interesting and very engaging to read. And it was, yeah, I quite enjoyed it just because of that aspect as well. And which, in my opinion, is I've read a number of historical works of historical fiction, and I'll admit that I'm not usually one to seek them out, but I found your book very somewhat different in the way that it wasn't trying to deviate from elements of history at all. It was trying to weave a narrative of what was happening behind closed doors on the backdrop of what the history was. And that's what I found very engaging. Um,
I, I felt it was, for me, it's essential to stick with the history. Absolutely essential. I'll give you an example. Some historical novelists, and I don't fault them for this, but they'll compress history just for the sake of the narrative. They'll put two events in history that took place far apart and bring them close together, or they will reverse the order in which things came for the benefit of the narrative, the story. And as I say, fiction is fiction, and more power to you. But I do not do that.
Mm.
I absolutely don't, because again, it would spoil it for me and my readers. If I know that something happened first and something happened in the next year, if I put it 5 years later, I know that's not true.
Mm.
So my book will lose its magic. So part of the magic of the book is that it is, to the extent that is realistically possible, it is real. It happened like that. That was a guiding light for me.
Mm. So in your mind, what is the relationship between history and historical fiction when you're approaching those two? That there's obviously a point where they can be in conflict, but then they do meet as well.
I think that they have slightly different purposes. The and again, I don't want to speak simply as if there's one purpose to either aspect, but the fiction is to create a world that your reader can live in. And history, in one way or another, and correct me, Mark, as a historian, if you feel I'm not giving history its full due or something, but history is to the best of our ability, help us understand what happened and to interpret it in terms of what you know, what the historian can know. Every historian gives a slightly different account of the same events. And we're very dependent on Thucydides, one historian, for so much of the period that we're both speaking about. But my job was to create a world that the reader can enter, be a part of, feel that they're a part of, feel immersed, meet the characters as if they're alive. And history is going to tell you perhaps who Pericles was. But history is not going to give you the opportunity to sit down with him at a symposium and join the toasts. History's going to give you the opportunity to know that Socrates was executed by the Athenians, but history is not going to give you the opportunity to meet Socrates and hear him spar and joke with his contemporaries. So they're doing different things. I love them both. I love history. Absolutely. After all, if you say, what is your profession? I'm an art historian. That's a historian.
Mm.
I love history. But I love a novel that will take me into it and make me a part of it. I love them both.
Yeah. And I guess you spoke about what got you into in Greek history. For me, it was Herodotus, and I loved. It was like a mashup of history, traditional tales. Like it wasn't. You couldn't take everything at face value, but there seemed to be a deeper meaning in some of the stuff he did present, and it was. I found that fascinating, and I still do. I still enjoy reading Herodotus just because of the stories that exist in there, and it's very entertaining.
So, how did you feel about the chapter in my novel where Herodotus gets to read part of his history? And the Athenians, Pericles and others are at a symposium. And I had so much fun writing this. Pericles and Phidias, the great artist of the Parthenon, and Socrates happens to be there as a young man. Socrates is very young in my novel. So the Socrates that we know as a philosopher is really only beginning then, and other great figures. And the idea is that evening at the symposium, the entertainment's going to be that Herodotus is going to read from his writing. And he reads part of this great story of the Battle of Marathon, which you covered in your podcast superbly, Mark, superbly. But then when he finishes reading about the battle, the men, they've been drinking at the symposium. Of course, the only women there are two hetaira, two courtesans, Aspasia and her friend Silky, who I invented. And then the question is, well, what else are you going to read, Herodotus? And he decides to read, he doesn't decide. They say, read about the sacred prostitutes in Mesopotamia. And he says, oh, I had so much fun writing this, Mark. Herodotus says, oh, no, not that again. Everybody always wants to hear about the sacred prostitutes. But they implore him and they say, come on, we want to hear it. We love that story. So he reads, he tells the story about the sacred prostitutes, according to Herodotus, which of course I took from Herodotus, who every woman once in her life, according to Herodotus, has to go to a sacred precinct and offer herself to the first man who comes along. And they make some jokes about how long some of the women will have to wait. But one of the characters says that Aspasia, if she were one of them, she's at this party, of course, she would bring a book to read while she was waiting. Anyhow, I had a lot of fun with Herodotus in that chapter.
Yeah, it's and it comes across too. I mean, we from the history we know he obviously wrote his history of the Greek and Persian wars, but then goes on to many digressions to talk about different cultures and places. And we know he had to recite it to public audiences. So it's interesting to see him then being asked to recite bits and pieces that people know that's in that history already, and just getting that behind closed doors sort of look of what may have been occurring. So that was very
That's
good.
exactly an example. Exactly. We know he would have been in the Agora reading his manuscript, but he was invited to a party, a symposium, where he was the main act in my novel. So you're right. It's a good example of what history isn't going to tell us, but you know it happened.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know that happened. You know he was invited and had to sing his song, so to say. You know it happened. So I had great fun figuring out, that's what happened. And here's how it would have gone.
Okay, so with your background in art history, I'm assuming you would have factored that into the novel Pericles and Aspasia as well. Is that right?
You bet. You know, in my novel, there are characters, and I'm proud of my characters. I think they're very vivid. If you read the book, you will love them. The Parthenon Temple is a character. If you think about it, early in the book, the first, almost the first chapter, third chapter, we are on the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is no more than a stone foundation. And the great Phidias, the great sculptor, Ectinus, the great architect, and Pericles are discussing issues about how this building is going to come into being, how it's going to be built. In the course of the novel, the Parthenon is constructed. If you think about that. And in the last chapter, which is called The Parthenon in Moonlight, the Parthenon is complete. By that I mean, the building has been completely constructed, and the great sculptures that to this day take our breath away, the great sculptures of the east gable, the east pediment of the Parthenon Temple that are in the British Museum and in a very controversial spot there, are finally set in place. So from the beginning of my novel to the end, just as the characters change and develop and resolve issues, the building is conceived, planned, thought about. It's in, what it should convey through its sculptures is invented in the course of my novel. And finally, in the last chapter, as I say, those great marbles, those great sculptures are there for us to see. That's one example of how art history, was a factor in the way I constructed the novel. The great golden ivory cult statue of Athena also grows from an idea to a completed golden ivory statue that is dedicated in the Parthenon. That happens in the book. And even in little ways, because I had studied, as I mentioned when I was speaking about my book on frontal faces, I had studied very seriously Greek vase painting in graduate school. And so every once in a while, I found my analogy, my image that could make an idea come alive in images that I know from Greek vase painting. For instance, Pericles has a bad dream, and it faced with an agonizing event. Pericles has a bad dream, and it has to do with a battle between a human and a lion. And I describe it, what Pericles saw in his dream. Well, that I saw that in Pericles' dream, and closing my eyes, thinking, what did Pericles dream? I saw that in terms of a vase, great vase painting drawing of a man struggling with a lion. So even in little ways, my art history background is immersed in the book.
And I definitely found there was a lot of, it was very descriptive around sculptures and architecture and that type of thing. You could really see it being described into your imagination for you. So obviously I've brought up that, well, we've brought up that Pericles and Aspasia, the novel, is a work of historical fiction. And I've already stated how it's very interesting how it follows the historical timeline, doesn't deviate from history, but shows a lot behind what was taking place behind closed doors, those glimpses of things that we don't get from history and that you think what's most likely to be taking place. Well, I thought we could perhaps turn to some historical elements that feature throughout the book and perhaps start with our, I guess, two main figures that feature in the book, Pericles and Aspasia. Could you give us a bit of a description of what we know about them historically?
Well, Pericles is as well known as anybody could be from that period. He's very well known, largely he figures in Herodotus. He is important in Thucydides, and he occurs elsewhere in ancient Greek texts, including, and of course, they has to be taken with a grain of salt, including in Greek comedy, in Greek comic writing. Pericles is very often referred to. So one way or another, we really know a lot about Pericles. As we know less about Aspasia, much less. I could tell you with, so to say, the 5 fingers of the hand, everything we know about her for a fact. She was born in Miletus, which is in East Greece. That is, the Aegean, of course, is the great, as your readers know, as your listeners know, the Aegean is the great offshoot of the Mediterranean. And at the time that we're both in love with, Mark and I are both in love with, clearly, Greece really circled the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea. So on the eastern coast of the Aegean were great Greek cities, including Miletus. And Aspasia came from there. Athens, of course, is on the west coast of the Aegean Sea. So she sailed to Athens. We know that because it's the only way she got there. If she was born in Miletus, she went by ship to Athens, one way or another. We happen to know her father's name was Axiochus. We know that she met Pericles in Athens, that she was a hetaira, a courtesan, as I mentioned, a geisha, somewhere in that area, kind of a multivalent idea, a hetaira, a woman who pleases men in one way or another. Hetaira means companion in Greek, comes from the Greek word companion. So she was a hetaira. Pericles fell in love with her. There is good evidence, so not conclusive, that he divorced his citizen wife, with whom he had 2 sons, and the wife, we don't have to feel she was abandoned. She went on to marry the richest man in Athens, richer than Pericles, who was a very wealthy aristocrat. And Pericles divorced his wife in order to live as if she were his wife with Aspasia. And they had a son named, and this is so remarkable, that Pericles gave his name to the boy, named Pericles. Pericles' son named Pericles, which I think is a very interesting and stunning fact, and shows Aspasia's influence on Pericles. So that much is known about Aspasia. After Pericles died, according to Plato, and we always have to remember that Plato is the most influential author in Western culture. And according to Plato, Aspasia conversed with philosophers, and not only conversed with them, but taught them, was a kind of philosopher herself. And in one dialogue of Plato, Plato has Aspasia teaching Socrates the art of public speaking. It's very difficult to know how to parse Plato's account of Aspasia in conversation with the philosophers, but this is a real where there's smoke, there's fire kind of issue. She probably did talk to philosophers. Whether she actually taught Socrates is a question in my mind, which I could perhaps interest your readers by mentioning it with a little more detail. And then she seems to have died around 400 BC. So those are really very few dots, but they are dots that have a lot of compelling indications, including the fact that Pericles fell in love with her and took her into his home. That's a lot to know.
Yeah, and it seems. Sorry, I was going to say it seems very likely that she would have been able to speak to other influential people within Athens too, just because of being married to Pericles. Obviously, right. He would have kept that sort of company, so she would have had them around her.
Well, I think she was probably an enchanting talker, a marvelous speaker. And by all indications, I didn't just think it for reasons we've already touched on even. I think we can believe that. And in my book, she's wonderful conversationalist, wonderful speaker, witty, smart, inventive. I think we have every reason to believe she was all those things.
I guess this gets to I found throughout the narrative there was the theme of the role of women was present within the book. What sort of life did women have in Athens, and whether it be, I guess, depending on their marital status or class, that would have had an influence, I'm assuming as well?
Well, in Athens, it's really a great irony that in this great democracy, the women were kept in more cloistered and under the thumbs of their male relatives than elsewhere in Greece. For instance, in East Greece, where Aspasia came from, women had more freedom. But the Athenian women were really limited in their lives, in the lives allowed to them. Most of them were not educated. Most of them did not know how to read. In my novel, Aspasia takes on the job not the job, but Aspasia teaches some of the women things. This is particularly true in my sequel. I have a sequel coming on the book. And in that book, in the sequel, we see her class. We actually go to class in Aspasia's home with Pericles, where the women come to see her. But most women live severely narrow, constrained lives, uneducated. Even, you mentioned different classes of women. Even aristocratic women did not necessarily have an education or know how to read. Lower class women had a little more freedom in the sense that some of them made a living. You might have had a fishmonger in a lower class woman, but the aristocratic women, of course, were not allowed jobs. So they really had their big excitement would be, and it was important, festivals and religious events. The women were allowed to participate, but always with great restraints in religious and events and festivals. And that would have been when they got out of the house. But they spent most of their time in the house in what is officially called the women's quarters. They can just home. They must have been really pale skinned because the very white skin was considered an element of beauty, so they didn't want to get suntanned. But Aspasia, of course, is the anomaly. She's independent. She goes where she wants. She says what she wants. She came educated. I, in my book, suggest that she, my novel, and who educated her? Her father, who I posit was a philosopher. My Miletus was a home for philosophy. Many of the great early Greek thinkers came from Miletus. So I suggest that Aspasia had a philosopher father. That's a fictional thought. We don't know that she had a philosopher father, but we know that somebody taught her, and she was highly educated, and she knew how to read, and she read. So she was a complete anomaly among these narrowly constrained Athenian women, and no doubt that's part of what attracted Pericles.
Yeah, I was going to ask, should we be thinking of Aspasia as a feminist heroine or a kept woman in this context?
Well, she was a kept woman, and it must have been nerve-wracking because he did not marry her, and so she must have always had to work for her living, if you know what I mean. She had to worry that he would continue to love her because she had no quote unquote hold on him that women feel sometimes. Marriage gives them less now, but certainly through much of history, a woman feels more secure if she's married. And Aspasia was not married. So she didn't have that, as I say, quotation marks, hold on her man. And she also had the problem of her son, who, because of an Athenian law that Pericles himself had, this is a great irony, shortly before he met Aspasia, a few years before, he passed a law that if an Athenian man, that a child, in order to be considered an Athenian citizen, both parents, mother and father, had to be Athenian citizens. He passed that law for a good reason, because the Athenians were sending out, as Mark, you described in your podcast, were sending out colonies of a special sort called cleroches, where the Athenian men would go to far-off places, establish a colony. They would still be citizens of Athens. But there they were in far-off places. They took wives who were not citizens of Athens. And the other side of it was Athens was, for reasons you too, again, have discussed superbly in your podcast, Athens was getting very rich from tribute, from from mercantile exchange. And many women would come to Athens in order to get in order to make a good match. So there were too many women in Athenian lives because the Athenian men had to take care of the Athenian citizen women, and there were all these, quote, other women around. So I hope I'm describing this appropriately.
Yeah.
So for Pericles, he's passed the laws in order to take care of this problem, because the Athenian women who didn't have educations, who didn't have vocations, they didn't have anything that made money. They had no way to live without men taking care of them. So the Athenian men had to take care of the Athenian women. For that reason, in part, he passed a law that said both parents must be Athenian citizens for a child to be considered an Athenian citizen. Well, young Pericles had Aspasia as his mother from somewhere else, Miletus. She was Greek, but she wasn't Athenian. So she had so in addition to refer to your question about kept woman, she not only had to protect her own position with Pericles, she had to advance and secure the life for her son. Pericles, as I mentioned, had 2 legitimate sons with his citizen wife, and here's this 3rd kid who's illegitimate. She worried terribly for that. You know it. It's not written in history, but you know she worried for her son, who had no protection in the city. You know that happened, and if you read my book, you'll see it happen.
That was... Sorry, I was just going to say that that was kind of where I was going next with around citizenship and how the theme features quite heavily throughout the book as well, and how it flows on from one generation to the next. And I just wanted to know how you featured it within the story that you had.
Well, you know, this really happened in history. In a year, and this happens in Pericles and Aspasia, the novel, in a year in which the Athenians were always worrying of whether they had enough wheat. Athens grew barley, but it did not grow wheat that well, not enough to feed this growing population, huge population by ancient standards. So in a very bad wheat year, an Egyptian from the Delta of Egypt, who for complicated reasons wanted to please the Athenians, made a gift of a huge amount of wheat to Athens. So the Athenians were very excited. It solved their problem. They wouldn't go hungry. We forget sometimes how this was hand to mouth, meal to meal culture. They were very excited that they got this gift from the Egyptian of this huge amount of wheat. The question was how to distribute it. And they quickly decided that it would only be distributed to citizens. It also became complicated because, you know, how many people are in your family and so on. But the basic point is it was only to be distributed to citizens. So what happened was there was an inquiry into who is really a citizen. And many people in Athens who had lived their whole lives as citizens, who had fought for Athens as citizens in war, were scratched off the citizen list by this scrutiny, by this examination. It turns out that we thought he was a citizen, but he really wasn't because his mother came from somewhere else, or there was some irregularity in his past. So this was a historical event in which to be a citizen meant everything. And again, to not be a citizen was revealed through this scrutiny. So what I did was I felt that was very important. This happened when Aspasia would have been in Athens with Pericles. In my book, she's pregnant with her child to be, and she witnesses people being thrown off the citizenship rolls, including a dear friend of hers, who was supposedly an Athenian citizen, and he isn't, it turns out, through an irregularity the irregularity in his past. So the point that I'd like to convey is that the larger historical fact has great personal, emotional impact on the fictional character, on the character of the book, on Aspasia. She sees how she already knew, but she sees more dramatically how crucial it is to be a citizen. And here she's going to bear a child who can't be a citizen. So her goal, one of her goals, becomes to somehow achieve citizenship for her young son, who is not yet born. She assumes it's a boy just because she's that kind of woman for the child that she's about to bear. And that theme of how is she going to persuade Pericles, or what is she going to do to give her son, her child, when he's born, that security of truly being an Athenian citizen, that great good in the ancient world. Look, today, people are struggling to get to some countries and out of other countries. In my country, the United States, people risk everything to get across the border into the U.S. and hopefully someday become a citizen. So this was true of Athens. People wanted that citizenship. And how is she going to get it? You're going to have to read the sequel to find out.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, like you said, we know historically that this is the whole background behind citizenship and what it meant. But I guess what you've done in the novel is you've shown how it affects people on the personal level. You have Aspasia grappling with the idea in her own mind when she becomes pregnant.
That's right. That's right. That's the interplay that you brought up, Mark, between history and historical novel. That's exactly it.
Well, I guess another interesting aspect, I guess, where we can look at perhaps history and fiction is around Pericles' speeches. Now, through the book, you have him deliver a few speeches, and he is known as a great orator. So the speeches that you did have him present in the book, are these ones that he actually gave, or did you do some inventing with his words?
I had to invent them. On what basis? There are 3 speeches that Pericles gives in Thucydides, but they all are given after the Peloponnesian War begins. And my book ends on the verge of the Peloponnesian War. And the sequel of my book, which is Sword of the War God, begins with what you recently had a podcast about, Corcyra, and the inflammatory incidents that initiate the final stream of tensions between Athens and Sparta. So Pericles and Aspasia ends just before that happens, when the Parthenon is complete. And so the speeches that Pericles gave, according to Thucydides, are all once the Peloponnesian War has broken out. So none of the speeches in Thucydides occur in the period of Pericles and Aspasia. So what did I do about the speeches? Well, we have good evidence for some of them. In particular, Plutarch, who wrote his lives much centuries later, writes about Pericles and tells us of the conflict, the political conflict that Pericles had with his arch political conservative opponent, whose name was Thucydides. Keep in mind that Thucydides is too bad, but there it goes. Life is complicated. Thucydides, who is Pericles' political opponent, is not Thucydides the historian. They had different fathers. We know the names of their fathers. They are not the same man. So the political opponent Thucydides attacked Pericles violently and with very strong and vulgar language in the Athenian assembly according to Plutarch. And Plutarch gives a pretty interesting, dramatic contrast and he tells us really on what grounds Thucydides attacked Pericles. So, in writing the speeches, in writing the chapter in which the conflict between Thucydides, the conservative politician, and Pericles, the liberal Democrat, confront each other, the subject happens to be paying money for work on the Parthenon temple. I use the indications from Plutarch of how those speeches would have gone. I also used a bit from Pericles' later speech in his funeral oration, which your listeners are listening to right now, as least today, and as we're doing the interview. You will remember that Pericles talks about that unless you're not really courageous. I'm paraphrasing it. Unless you know what is sweet in life, without knowing what is sweet in life, it's not exactly courageous. Sweetness is what brings courage into bloom and to the fore. Well, he said that later in the speech during the Peloponnesian War. And it's so eloquent. It's so eloquent. But I felt that he could have had the thought also when he's speaking to Thucydides, because Thucydides is being vulgar. And he's talking about, he says, Pericles is spending so much money on the Parthenon. It's as if he's adorning a prostitute, his Hetaira. Thucydides had a bad mouth. And I thought it was natural for Pericles to counter Thucydides by turning it around. After all, Pericles is a great orator. To turn around the words of your opponent in a new way is a great orator's device. So my Pericles says, in answer to Thucydides, yes, you should fall in love. You should fall in love with Athens for its beauty. So he turns the rather vulgar aspersion into a beautiful idea that you should fall in love with Athens, as he speaks later of falling in love with the sweetness of life. So and other speeches, for instance, there's another speech where Pericles says, all right, Athenians, if you aren't going to pay for the marble, for the gold and ivory, pardon me, not the marble, the ivory. If you refuse to pay for the ivory, for the gold and ivory, Athena, I'll pay for it myself, he says in a speech. It's in my book. He says, I'll pay for it myself, only the inscription will credit not the Athenians for building this temple, for building this statue, they will credit me. Well, Pericles is reported to have expressed that idea. So I did not invent that idea. I absorbed it and moved it to a place where I invented a speech. So the answer to your question is, I invented the speeches. I had the temerity. I had the guts to pick up what I felt was Pericles' style. I wrote Pericles' speeches as a speechwriter would. After all, even Barack Obama, who was a great speaker, had speechwriters. I was a speechwriter for Pericles in my book, but in doing it, I drew upon the evidence of what he would have said and how he would have said it. Still, I had a heck of a lot of fun writing those speeches.
I bet, and it's not out of the ordinary either, because we know, even as Thucydides says himself, the historian, that his speeches are not word for word that he has come out of Pericles' mouth, and he tries to convey what the sense of the situation would have called for.
That's right.
This is much like what you're doing, except I guess you're a bit more removed from the situation.
That's right. I didn't hear him say it. And Thucydides says, even Thucydides says, I heard some of this, gives you the idea. I heard some of the speeches, and some of them I heard about from other people. But I didn't hear any of them, and nobody I know heard them. So that is a little bit more removed. But you know what, Mark? Pericles spoke through my mind.
Mm.
I mean, we were together on it. It just happens. I just feel, I don't want to sound sort of kooky. I'm a realist, and my book is very realist. But I feel when I'm writing a speech for Pericles, I'm somehow part Pericles. I don't know how else to say it.
Mm. And I mean, I've said it again. It's what you do right in the book. It seems very plausible that this is what was happening behind closed doors. It doesn't. Nothing seems far-fetched. It seems like it actually belongs in that setting.
It does.
Mm.
It does. I got the word. It does.
So, sticking with Pericles, we know through our sources that he was born with a overlarged head, and it is, I guess, the topic of ridicule for some comic poets, and he would have suffered some retorts probably in the political arena over it as well. So, and this point does come up a number of times within the novel. Why does this, I guess, birth defect matter, and how does it figure into your narrative?
Well, I think it was very important to Pericles. In thinking about the psychological portrait of the man, he was a second son. He had an older brother who didn't have this birth defect of this extremely enlarged head. And I think that I think it was a burden in every sense. It was a big head. It was heavy. He had a very handsome face, evidently from the portrait that we have of him, but his head was not handsome to have this great big boneless top that people looked like a melon or a sea cucumber, and made all kinds of jokes. And the comic poets, as you say, had a field day with his birth defect. People weren't sensitive about about that in those days. They let him have it. I think he compensated in part. Part of his greatness is probably overcoming the challenge of having this ugly, and putting it in terms of the Greeks of that time, ugly deformity. They would not have seen it as anything but unattractive, and that's why he said to wear his helmet whenever he could, because it covered up his head, and then he looked handsome because all you saw was his good-looking face, as in the portrait that you included in your podcast about Pericles' funeral oration. That portrait shows him with the helmet, with good reason. There was another way in which this birth defect was sublimated. The narrative theme of the east pediment of the Parthenon temple is the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. Now, this happens to have been a known story, but kind of old-fashioned. It wasn't an upfront. It was an odd choice for the East. Don't forget the East, the side, the sunrise, the most important pediment, the most important position for sculpture in the temple, outside of the cult statue of golden ivory that stood within it. The East pediment of the Parthenon, the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. And it appears, and in my book, you will see this idea develop, that what Phidias and Pericles, and perhaps with the philosophers at hand helping, conceived was that by showing Zeus, and you need to know that Pericles in this period was often called Zeus, particularly by the same comic poets who made fun of his head. They called him Zeus. Zeus, king of the gods. So the birth of Athena, which showed in the center of the pediment, Athena being born from the head of Zeus, is a kind of sublime reinterpretation of Pericles' swollen head. Zeus, who carried Athena in his head, that's how he did it. He didn't carry it like a woman in the belly. She is his brainchild. She is an emanation from the brain of Zeus, king of the gods, who in this period and in the thinking of some philosophers was not just kind of, Papa Zeus, like in the myths, but a kind of transcendent cosmic force. That wisdom, the goddess of wisdom, is born from this pregnant, swollen head of Zeus in the most magnificent sculptures that the world has ever seen. As I mentioned, the East Pediment sculptures in the British Museum. The subject was, in a way, one way of looking at it is a sublime interpretation of Pericles, Zeus, leader of the Athenians, with his swollen head. I hope I've made that clear. It's a lot to take in, but is an artistic transformation of a breathtaking level. It is one of the greatest artistic transformations of an idea that I know. Well, it's the greatest. I'll tell you, it's the greatest. It's the top. Now, little problem. When the Parthenon exploded, the central portion of the pediments were destroyed. So I'm talking to you about a sculpture of Zeus in the center of the east pediment of the Parthenon that we can't see. It doesn't exist today. But it does exist in the Athenians, the Greeks, not only the Athenians, the Greeks. It was, they made coins, they made drawings. There are plenty of indications of what it looked like. So we're not completely in the dark, and I'm not making up smoke and mirrors here. Think about that. The man gets born with his overlarge head, and the greatest sculptor who ever lived, Phidias, with help, no doubt, in conversation, conceives of Zeus pregnant in his head with knowledge, enlightenment. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. That's the Greeks. That's the Greeks.
Yeah, and obviously Pericles with his overlarge head and then that's connected with Athena, who's the patron goddess of Athens, who's associated with wisdom. And then we often see in depictions of statues of Athena that she also has the same hoplite helmet, not covering her face, but up on her forehead, just like Pericles is depicted.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah, so there's lots of little, I guess, connections that, and I'm assuming Pericles probably this wouldn't have been lost on him either. He would have done a lot of these things on purpose because of what they represented in Athens as well. So yeah, it's interesting to see all the different representations that he could take.
I think it's not too much to say that Phidias, Pericles, and in particular, the philosopher that Pericles most followed, named Anaxagoras. Pericles called Anaxagoras his teacher. And Anaxagoras had this, what I mentioned before, it really beyond what we think of as classical mythology, a vision of Zeus as not an individual with a staff and a thunder, with a thunderbolt and an eagle and his attributes that the Greeks expected to see, but a Zeus that was a kind of transcendent cosmic force of energy, the origin of all things through energy, setting the cosmos in motion. So this, when Phidias made the sculptures of the pediment, he showed us the gods looking like the Greeks expected them to. Zeus, fatherly, handsome older man with his thunderbolt, Athena with her helmet, and the other gods as they were supposed to, quote unquote, look. But at the same time, on another level, these easy to understand gods represented this new vision of a more abstract, elevated idea that was promulgated by the philosopher Anaxagoras, I mentioned, who Pericles was very influenced by. So I think Phidias, Pericles, Anaxagoras, Aspasia, and others, and for them, they were able to conceive this multi-level, multi-layers of meaning in the pediment, including the one I've described.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting and very thought-provoking too.
Not everybody agrees with me.
I mean, this is the thing when you're writing historical fiction, you can take these sorts of ideas that we don't know for sure, but it's plausible, and you can run with it and develop it as you see it may have existed in those times.
Right. For me, I just have to say though, for me, it's got to be most plausible. In other words, I'm not, how to put it, I don't play with it. I zero in on what I think is real. I'm always looking for the real, even if I can't always find it.
Yeah, and I've said a number of times, it definitely comes through in the book too.
I'm glad.
So I guess we've spoken about a number of figures within the book already, to a certain degree, and you do include a number of historical figures throughout the narrative, such as, I guess, we've already touched on Socrates. But how did you go about developing him as a character in the story?
Socrates in particular?
Yeah, start with him.
He was, as I said, very young. The Socrates that we know of in Plato's dialogues is a little, that's a little, Plato was after Pericles. So Socrates was very young. The first appearance in my book of Socrates is at that symposium, that drinking party that I mentioned before, where Herodotus spoke. And he's kind of a brash young man asking questions. And we know that Socrates was, again, in Greek terms, not handsome. We know that we have sculptures of him. We know what he looked like, and the Greeks didn't admire his particular features. And Aspasia says, why did that impertinent young man get invited? He isn't even good looking. So that's a glimpse at the very young Socrates. But in the course of the book, he gets older like everybody else does. And he begins to be a character who inquires and asks others questions, because we know the Socratic method is a questioning, drawing the reader to his ideas through asking questions. So you may recall the scene in the Palestra, the wrestling grounds, where Socrates is with a group of young men, which is well attested. That's what he usually was doing, talking to young men, and where they have an inquiry into some of the things that Socrates, we know, would have been interested in. So drawing upon the Socrates that we know from Plato, and also the Socrates again that we know from the comic playwrights, because Socrates was not immune from their jests. We know a lot about his personality, and I feel I was able to draw on that pretty clearly. One person, somebody I admire very much, particularly liked a letter. In my book, there's one chapter where letters are exchanged across great distances, and Socrates writes a letter in answer to a question that he's asked. And I invented the letter, but I shaped it according to Socrates' way of spinning out ideas. So that's how Socrates developed. Socrates is very important in the sequel as well.
I bet.
And the other characters from history, Phidias is a character. Sophocles, the playwright, figures importantly in my book as a friend of Pericles. The important thing for me in bringing in known historical characters was they had to be intrinsic to the story. I wasn't going to, kind of pull in well-known names as kind of cameos. Oh, gee, look, there's Socrates, there's Sophocles, there's Phidias or Pericles. They all they're there in character and in the way they relate to the other characters. They're part of the story. They're not just tossed in like little gems. They matter in terms of the plot, in terms of the emotions, in terms of the characters, in terms of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you can definitely see that as well taking place. I mean, I know we've already spoken about him too, but that was definitely one of my favorite elements was the relationship between Pericles and the politician Thucydides.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed definitely researching and writing that part of my podcast as well. It's just a very interesting interaction that was taking place in the political arena.
It sure was.
Well,
what?
I thought. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention. I don't know whether it will interest your listeners. How I handled important historical. How I've handled war.
That's
battles.
Exactly what I was about. That's exactly what I was about to just get onto. And it was kind of to wrap up our sort of historical look at things. I wanted to move on to how the siege of Samos was depicted in the book, since this takes up a large focus in the narrative as well.
It takes up a large part of it. It's a big story. I sometimes think I should have divided into 2 chapters, but it's okay. Pericles was occupied a lot with the island of Samos. And in this period in which my book covers, he went there 2 times. The first time, because there was a rebellion, and he, with great ease, like in a day, quelled the rebellion and reinstated a democracy, which he always felt that democracies, not all the allies of Athens were democracies, but Pericles and the Athenians believed democracies would be favorable to Athens. So he installed the democracy and came home. The next thing you know, Samos rebelled again. The aristocrats who had fled at the time of the first episode returned, and they, with the help of the Persians, who were always funneling money to Athenians, to Greeks who were anti-Athenian, with the help of Persian gold, they freed the hostages, the Samian hostages that Pericles had taken. And so Samos was again in rebellion. Now, we know that, and we know that Pericles went there. We know how many ships, we know many of the details of numbers, but we don't know how the siege went. We know he besieged Samos, but we don't know how it went. There's no description of it. So I so the Samos incident is real. Both times he went, that's real. That he returned, that he took however many ships, and that the Athenians then sent however many additional ships. All that is recorded. So that's known. Although, here's a parenthesis. The Athenians, Thucydides, and the other Athenian texts, the other writers of the past, tend to round things off. Everything is in round numbers. So it's always like 30 ships, 40 ships, 50 ships. This happens so regularly, you have to think maybe it was 55 ships, maybe it was 48 ships, they said. So this rounding off numbers is worth noticing. But still, we have numbers that certainly give a good approximation of what kind of force of arms Pericles had in Samos. How did the siege work? How did the Athenians besiege those walls? Did they succeed? How did they succeed? We know that it ended with an agreement between Pericles and the leader of the Samians. How did that happen? Read my book and you'll find out, because you're not going to find out anywhere else. I made it happen for the book. So in other words, the outlines of the Samian wars are there with some details about numbers. But when you read my book, you are at Samos. You are besieging the Samians. You are having a devastating disaster as a result of that siege. And you are in there when Pericles negotiates with the leader of the Samians to end the war. So that's how the history and the novel coalesce.
Yeah, and that's one of the big problems, especially with historical accounts, is we know battles happened and we don't get much description about why things happened, why victory took place. And a lot of battles we're left to just know the battle took place, the Athenians won, and then we're not sure how it occurred. And I guess with sieges, I've found through the historical record that it was very rare for a side to be able to actually break the walls of a siege. For the most part, these would be resolved through negotiations or through treachery within inside the city. And that's typically how they resolve themselves, if they were a victory, of course.
It's absolutely true. It's so much true that I sometimes wonder why they kept trying to besiege, but they certainly did. They certainly did.
All right. Well, I had just a couple more questions, points of interest before we do wrap things up. You said that in your book that you traveled to most of the places that figure in Pericles and Aspasia, and you followed in their tracks. What are some of the places that you had been to, and how does their experience of being there figure in the novel?
And it could be in two ways. Here's an example. A very important event in Pericles' life was an expedition he led to the Black Sea, to the north shore of the Black Sea, to what is today Ukraine. Ukraine is being fought over because it's a very rich territory and it grows a lot of wheat. Guess what? In Pericles' day, it grew a lot of wheat, and the Athenians needed wheat, and that Egyptian connection wasn't very stable. So Pericles led a vast expedition to the north shore of the Black Sea through what was then what we know today as Istanbul, ancient Byzantium. And I wanted to see the Black Sea. Now, I did not do anything like what Pericles, in this case, what Pericles did. He took 50 ships across the Black Sea from the south to the north. How did he do that, by the way? How do you have 50 ships in line across a rough sea? It's astonishing what he was able to do, and what was able to be accomplished. But I wanted to see the Black Sea. Now, we went to the south shore of the Black Sea and we looked at it. Now, that's a kind of pilgrimage visit. If you had told me that I was looking at, the Straits of Gibraltar, I would have believed you. It was water, rough. I had to get there. It did not affect the way I wrote the story. Well, yeah, a little bit it did. Somehow being there does. But on the other hand, we went to Samos. Now there, it was all important. Samos has a very wide, we've already talked about the fact that Samos was a large issue in Pericles' work, his day. Samos has a very broad harbor, and it has a very long breakwater, a remarkable breakwater. The one you would see if you went there today that I saw has been rebuilt, but it's been rebuilt the same way that the ancient Samians built it, the same direction, the same length, the same place. The Samians were famous for being engineers. So we went to Samos, and we went to the harbor, and I walked out on that long breakwater. I had to do it so that when I was able to envision what the sea battles that took place both inside the harbor and in the waters just outside the harbor, I'd been there. I knew exactly what that looked like. I knew what it felt like. I knew what the dimensions felt like. So my visit to Samos was extremely purposeful in that way. I went to Miletus, where Aspasia was born. Of course, with all of that, I went again and again to the Parthenon. Because, like Pericles' funeral oration in words, the Parthenon temple is in my heart, the be-all and end-all. That building is simply unending in its fascination and beauty. And I was fortunate the first time I went, the Parthenon was more accessible than it is today. So I went to the Parthenon inside the remaining standing columns. The columns that stand make it look a little bit like it's a whole building, but inside it's a bombed out shell. But I went inside and I stood on the foundation spot where the golden ivory Athena stood. And that was part of what enabled me to bring that to life. Being there. I stood there. Now, a puzzle is the golden ivory Athena is very, very big. She went really almost to the roof. And I always wondered, how did it actually look inside the building? I looked at reconstructions. People make, drawings. They work on that. I just couldn't understand it, really. So I went to Nashville, Tennessee in the United States, where there is a scale model of the Parthenon, built to scale in cheap materials, not marble, but it's built to scale. And it has a built to scale cult statue. And I had to go there because I had to answer that question. How crowded was it inside the temple? Didn't that big golden ivory statue crowd the temple? And could Phidias make a mistake like that? So I went to Nashville. I went inside. I looked at the golden ivory statue inside their scale model. It's to scale, built the Parthenon. And you know what? It's very crowded. I think Phidias overdid it. The statue really takes up too much of the inside. So that's another kind of pilgrimage. But anyhow, going where Aspasia was born, standing on the shore from which Pericles embarked, though I never went across the ocean, across the Black Sea to Crimea. It's so amazing to think today what Crimea is and what it was in those days. And standing at Samos and visiting some of the other sites near Miletus, where Aspasia might have, for instance, participated in a temple festival. Yes, I had to do it. I had to be there.
And with it, I mean, obviously all these sites are in ruins or they're reconstructions, like you said. Does that become frustrating, or does it allow you to really engage your imagination and really try and, I guess, imagine what life was like?
Yeah, my imagination goes to work. I build them. I build them right in there in my forehead. I see them all. I mean, the Agora in Athens is an example. So much in the book happens in the Agora. That is the great marketplace of Athens. And that excavation is been brilliantly done, but it's, it is, you do have to understand what you're looking at. But yeah, I walked through the Agora and I saw Socrates where he would have spoken to the young men. I know where Aspasia would have bought fish and where she would have bought that book that figures so importantly in the early chapter. There's an account that there was a book. There's an account somewhere. I can't find the original source, but I remembered it. So I put it in my book. I'm still looking for the original source, which I lost, of a pale bookseller who sold books under a big tree in a corner of the Agora. I went to the Agora to find the big tree that the bookseller sold books under. And I went to the Agora to find where the bookmaker, whose home has been excavated and who figures in the book, where his book shop was. I went to Piraeus, the port city of Athens, to, of course, spent a lot of time in Piraeus, and sailed out of Piraeus to Aegina, as Pericles would have sailed out of Piraeus to Aegina, so the island of Aegina. So, yeah, I build it in my mind as I see it.
Yeah, and it definitely comes across. Like, it's just the description or the descriptive terms that you use definitely. It feels like what you're trying to feel and convey is just implanted into your head when you read through the narrative as well. Even though I've yet to visit Greece, so it's
Mark, you have wonderful.
Yes.
You'll faint. You'll get weak knees. I did. Every time I go, I'm weak in the knees to think I'm there in Greece. And your listeners who haven't been there, they will have the thrill ahead.
Yes, I can't wait to go. We're planning to go. We've been waiting for the kids to get a little bit older so they can really appreciate it. So hopefully in the next couple of years we'll get there. Now, obviously, we've brought up a couple of times that you are working on a sequel to Pericles and Aspasia. What was the title of the second book going to be called?
Sword of the War God.
Sword of the War God. Okay.
I could ask you a question, and your listener, and I would welcome an answer. I wanted to call this book, which by the way is nearly finished. I wanted to call the book Ares' Spear, because Ares is the god of war, as you know. Ares' Spear would be spelled with a possessive apostrophe, right? A-R-E-S apostrophe Spear, Aries spear.
Yep.
I want to call the book that, but I feel, and here I would really welcome input from you, that it might be too obscure. Ares is not the most famous of the Greek gods. You know, Athena is famous. Not everybody knows who Ares is. So I changed the working title to Sword of the War God. But do you think, you don't have to tell me now, you could tell me another time. Could I get away with Ares spear, or is it too confusing?
I guess it's a tough one, considering I know exactly who Aries is and what it means. Perhaps to someone that isn't reading, maybe, yeah, like you say, the just invoking the war god. People who know who Aries is would know that that's who you're referring to. But I guess more general readership, it would be a bit more generalized as well.
That's my thought. I
Mm.
just like the sound of Aries. Well, I love the Greek sound of the word Aries. I love Greek
Mm.
words. I love Greek language. So Aries pleases me, but I think you're probably right. Sword of the war god conveys the idea, and maybe more telling to people, more immediately. Oh,
Mm.
I guess right. Yeah,
Yeah, you don't
probably.
necessarily need to know who Aries is, but for those who do, the war god makes it clear who you're talking about as well.
Yeah.
Hmm. But I guess before we do go, are you able to give us a few little maybe snippets or ideas of what we can expect in the sequel?
It's tragic. Pericles and Aspasia has is about life, and so it has good things and bad things. Not everything that happens is happy, but it's fundamentally a joyous book. It's fundamentally a book about a wonderful love, about wonderful idealistic goals, about democracy achieved. It's a joyous book. The Sword of the War God is tragic. The ending is, which I'm not going to divulge, although it's in history. Could be, you could look it up, but I'll just say the ending is unutterably tragic. And it brings to mind that of the many reasons I wrote the book, these two books, and of course, the important one is the one I've mentioned. I wanted to be there. I wanted to live there. I wanted my readers to know, to share this fabulous world of ancient Athens. But I also wanted to answer a question. Pericles was as smart as anybody has ever been, and as idealistic as anybody has ever been. These were the best and the brightest. And my question is, and Mark, I'll be very interested in how you handle this question, which you will deal with, I know, in the course of your podcast. I'll be so fascinated. How did it happen that the labors of the best and the brightest ended in such disaster? So that's a clue.
Mm.
Uh, I imagine there will be people who are loving now Pericles and Aspasia who may not want to face that tragedy, but it's part of the truth. It's part of the truth, and I'm a truth person.
Yeah. Do you have a rough idea of when we could perhaps see that Sword of the War God published?
Um, I would say less than 2 years, more than 1 year.
Okay. Yep. It'd be interesting to see how you deal with those topics too. And once it does come out, I think it would be very interesting to get you back on and have another chat, and where we can talk about the events during the actual Peloponnesian War and how things unravel.
Yes, yes. That would be an incentive for getting the book out, just to talk with you about that.
It'd be very interesting. Well, Yvonne, thanks for coming on to talk about Pericles and Aspasia. It's been very interesting, and definitely exploring the fictional and the historical elements, and seeing how they interact with each other. It's been great to talk to you.
It's been such a pleasure.
And if people wanted to follow you or buy a copy of Pericles and Aspasia, is there a best site to go to or store to visit?
It's in most online bookstores, but I hate to say it, but the fact is the easiest is Amazon, where there's a lot about the book. If you go there, there are quotations and reviews, and you can get a good flavor of the book on the Amazon site more than the other sites. It's really the best site to go to. And I also have my website, YvonneKorshak.com. So I welcome you to my web page, my website, and and the book is available on Barnes & Noble, Bookshelf, Booktopia in Australia.
Yep.
Has it. And Australians have been buying the book. I do have a way of knowing not much, but a little bit about who likes to read this book. And since I'm in the U.S., well, there are a lot of sales in the U.S., but Britain and Australia have been interested in my story. So Booktopia has been a good place to go.
That's good. I'll put up the links of where your book can be found, and also to your website on the episode page, so people can easily click on there and find Pericles and Aspasia and look at what you're up to as well.
Thank you. That'll be great. And you can be sure I'll be watching what you're up to, Mark.
No worries. I'll make sure I get things right.
Oh, you're great.
No worries. So thanks, Yvonne, and greatly appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed my talk with Professor Korshak, where I felt we were able to cover such a wide range of topics, which all centred around her book Pericles and Aspasia. I felt I learned a great deal from Yvonne, and really look forward to being able to talk to her again. We'll be able to compare notes on events during the Peloponnesian War, once her sequel, Sword of the War God, is released. If you found our talk engaging, I would encourage you to share it with others that you know to have an interest in history. Also, if you would like to read Pericles and Aspasia for yourself, head over to your favourite bookstore and pick yourself up a copy. I've put links up to a few places to purchase Yvonne's book, as well as a link to her website. And remember to enter the draw for your chance to win one of 3 copies of Pericles and Aspasia. Just head to Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, make sure you're following Casting Through Ancient Greece, like the post promoting the interview, then share it, retweet it, or share to your story. On the 8th of September, I'll randomly draw 3 lucky winners and notify them on the platform they entered on. So, help spread the word about this interview and Yvonne's excellent book, Pericles and Aspasia, while giving yourself the chance to win a copy. Next episode, we'll be getting back on track with our narrative through the Peloponnesian War, where we'll be looking at the events that would take place during the second year, as well as the devastating plague that would break out in Athens. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting me on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. If you've also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series with episode 76, The Plague of Athens.